The first shot was fired, pun intended, in a New York Times op-ed yesterday by retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, calling for repeal of the Second Amendment. Second Amendment is, of course, the one that states the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So upon hearing the call for its repeal, the president was quick to offer his all-caps response on Twitter. The Second Amendment will never be repealed. No way. We need more Republicans in 2018 who must always hold the Supreme Court. And never wins the fight just one single constitutional battle at a time. The Trump administration has also convinced the Commerce Department to add a controversial element to the 2020 census, asking people if they are U.S. citizens.
We've contained this question that's provided data that's necessary for the Department of Justice to protect voters and specifically to help us better comply with the Voting Rights Act, which is something that is important and a part of this process.
But opponents say it's important for another reason. Because the data from the census is what's used to determine how many congressional representatives each state gets, for example, and how much federal money is sent their way, too. So if you have a bunch of people suddenly not responding to the census because they're afraid of, I don't know, say being deported, then the state where those people live will end up with less money and less representation. And that's exactly why Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey and a slew of other AGs are suing the federal government. Joining me to discuss all that are Andrea Cabral, former State Secretary of Public Safety and Suffolk County Sheriff. Good to see you, Andrea. And Jennifer Braceras is a conservative columnist whose work appears in the Wall Street Journal and the National Review. Good to see you, too. Let me start with you. You heard Sarah Huckabee Sanders saying it's about voting rights, voting empowerment. It's really about suppression, isn't it? It's not about empowering anybody, is it?
I don't think so. I personally think more information is better, and the federal government has a right to collect this information. And in fact, Sarah Sanders had some of her facts wrong, but the fact is...
She had almost all of her facts wrong about when that question has been asked on the broad census in the past.
But the truth is that question has been asked on the long form for a number of years, and then when the long form switched over to the American Community Survey, it's being asked on that survey.
It was 68 years ago was the last time it was asked, right? 1950, wasn't it?
No. 1950 was the last time it was asked of every American filling out the census. But it has been asked for a long time on the long form, which goes to a much smaller subset of Americans. But in fact, I just filled it out a few weeks ago, the American Communities version of it, and it does in fact ask
it's 3.5 million people as opposed to 340
million. Right, but it has been asked. It's not that controversial to expand it to a larger number of people.
It's not that controversial. You just heard Jennifer say, so I assume you agree, Andrea?
Couldn't disagree more.
Why is that?
It's actually one of the more or perhaps the most fundamentally democratic thing that happens in this country. First of all,
the census.
The census. The Constitution requires it. It is the one thing that we do that literally measures every man, woman, and child without regard to who they are or their background.
The Constitution says that, which I didn't know till this morning. I'm embarrassed to say.
Yes, and it's called a complete enumeration. That's what's required. But what it also does is it allows people to stand up and be counted in this way without having the fear that and we have lots of families where there is sort of a mixed citizenship within the family without having the fear that there will be consequences for that. And we historically have done that. In World War II, there were Japanese Americans who answered the census. That information was turned over to the Secret Service.
That is illegal.
And those people were rounded up and put in internment camps. And if you look at what ICE is doing right now, pulling people out of churches, people waiting to drop their kids off at school, out of hospitals in order to deport them.
Census data is confidential.
There was a woman sitting here the other night who was in exactly that circumstance.
It is absolutely
it's a legitimate fear.
It is absolutely confidential. And let me say that it behooves politicians and community leaders to try to quell panic about what this could happen, not to incite fear of the federal government.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Why is it the responsibility of community leaders to step in and quell fears that are literally being generated day after day at the from the very top of the White House on down? That fear is coming from the President of the United States, the Department of Justice under Jeff Sessions, the Department of Homeland Security, even the Interior
I will
and EPA.
give you this. What census workers will tell you is that since President Trump took office, fear about the census has increased generally. That is true. This question shouldn't add to that one way or the other, because this question is particularly legitimate. And it is up to politicians, including the President of the United States, and as well as community leaders, to try to assure the American people that the taking of the census is routine, that this is confidential, that it is illegal to turn the information over to the INS or the FBI, which it is.
Would you trust President Trump if he were to say that, Jennifer Braceras?
Well, it's the truth.
Would you trust that it would not be transferred inappropriately, if not illegally?
I could only hope to place that faith in the president.
The answer to that is no,
yes.
because no one in their right mind trusts anything that Donald Trump ever says or does. But more importantly,
so we shouldn't do. Wait, let's be clear here, Andrew, if you can, for a second. If you agree that it's illegal to use that information, it's confidential, you're basically saying the reason why one should have concern is because you were convinced the federal government is going to break the law. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yes, but I think that there's plenty of indication in history that they may be inclined to do that. But let me ask this. If it's such an appropriate question, if it's such an appropriate question and there's nothing wrong with it, why haven't we done it on the short form all these years? Why hasn't that happened since 1950? And there's
we've been asking it on the long form. We're just
for
expanding
a very small subset of people. There are reasons why it would not have been expanded to the larger group of people, namely because even Native Americans have historically been undercounted. People of color have historically been undercounted, but we've still gotten a basically good count. People are quite sure, including past heads of the Census Bureau who have all weighed in on this, that if this question is to be included, people will not respond to the census.
We have to hold it there.
It's like the Electoral College. It's an Electoral College mentality applied to the census.
We have to hold it right there because I want to talk about the other thing I mentioned a minute ago. John Paul Stevens, former Justice Supreme Court, says repeal the Second Amendment. When gun control advocates make their case, what the other side always says is, they don't want gun control. They want repeal of the Second Amendment. Didn't John Paul Stevens play into the hands of what he would probably perceive to be his worst enemies on this issue?
I don't know that he played into their hands as much as I think he was speaking his truth as a former justice of the Supreme Court, and understanding how whatever its genesis, whatever the NRA's genesis, what it has evolved into is what Chief Justice Berger said, perpetrating one of the largest frauds in the American people. And it's also quite clear that whatever the Second Amendment started out to be back when people were using muskets and you could basically go in your house, make a sandwich and eat it before somebody reloaded their gun, whatever it started out to be, that is not the way it is interpreted now. And it took over 200 years and one Supreme Court case
DC
to decide
versus
that there
Heller,
was an
where
individual.
Stevens sat on the court and lost 5-4.
Right.
So you and I have talked about this for many years. You know I'm a conservative who believes in regulation at the margins of weapons, and I'm not a big NRA person, but I attribute that to the fact that, I grew up in urban and suburban communities, and this is really an issue where a lot of people like us don't know gun owners, right? And the fact of the matter is 43% of Americans live in homes with a gun, okay? The NRA is powerful because there are a lot of people who support what they do, whether they're members or not.
Powerful also because they have a Second Amendment, unlike NRA-like organizations in other countries which can't rely on a Second Amendment, so they have more sensible gun laws.
No, that is true. It's part of the Constitution. But to your point earlier, I don't understand why the progressives haven't gotten the memo about what people in this country feel and what they think. Because the bottom line is 43% of Americans live in a home with guns. They're going to see what former Justice John Paul Stevens wrote. And I guarantee you contributions to the Trump re-election campaign are going to go through the roof.
Jennifer, very quickly, you say they haven't gotten the message. If you look at the things on the list of demands, for lack of a better expression, from these Parkland high school students, every single one of them has majority support. Some have 90-plus support, like universal background checks.
Don't do this.
You agree with that, do you not?
I think
it's political suicide.
Well, let's start here. The idea
that
the NRA represents gun owners versus gun manufacturers is just an absolute lie. That's where the money is. That's what the NRA cares about. They just want more guns manufactured. But second of all, if there is the threat of actually repealing the Second Amendment, then maybe that gets people to the table on regulating guns as we do any other piece of property that people own, like a car.
That may be as a negotiating tactic, but I think it's going to backfire.
We got to go. Andrea, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Pleasure. Jennifer, as always,
Nice to
good to see you. Thanks so much. Glad we resolved those issues.